When most of us think about renewable energy, we think about renewable electricity. But currently only 22% of the energy we consume is the electricity that powers our homes and businesses. Did you know that we use twice that, 44% of the energy we consume in the form of heat? Ireland placed last in the use of renewable energy for heating and cooling among EU countries. But with heat dominating our use of energy, we simply must turn this around. To find out how, I'm talking with two people who are not only thought leaders on the topic of renewable heat, but who work at the coalface of making it a reality. Dr. David Connolly, former CEO of Wind Energy Ireland and now CTO of clean heat provider Astatine, and Donna Gartland, CEO of Dublin's energy agency Codema, who has been driving the development of district heating in Ireland for the best part of a decade. I'm Paddy Finn, and this is the Electricity Exchange. Donna, David, it's great to see you both. So Ireland has done so well on its integration of renewable electricity. So we feature above average in Europe for the integration of renewable electricity. And when we take out the countries that have the benefit of hydro, which is much easier to integrate than the variable sources that we have, we place up there as leaders. But we've placed last in terms of the use of renewable energy for heat, whereas we use twice as much heat as we use electricity. So when we look at Sweden, Estonia and Finland that have features on top, have they some advantage that we don't have? Or can we learn from what it is that they've done and just replicate it here?
Yeah, well, certainly as someone who's probably lived in the electricity and heat worlds in Ireland over the last few years, I think for electricity, the big thing was vision and clarity of vision and clarity of purpose. So when you look back on the story of getting us to probably, top of the table in the world when it comes to renewable electricity, it probably all started around the late noughties when, I think the All Island Grid study around January 2008 kind of set a vision for 2020. It almost aligned regulators, policymakers, the industry, supply chains on a common vision that enabled everyone to kind of know that this is what's coming, this is what we're trying to deliver, this is what we're trying to achieve. That clarity never came in renewable heat. And I think the reason it didn't is there just wasn't the same common understanding of what needed to be done. In a way, for renewable electricity, the answer was obvious. It's windy. Wind was incredibly well proven at that stage as relative to most renewable energy technologies. Ireland was a relatively windy place, like probably top 2 windy places in Europe, and we didn't really have a huge amount of alternatives. Whereas there was certainly not that clarity for heat. Like there was probably a lot of debate about what should we do. And I would say there is absolutely no reason why we couldn't copy our European neighbours.
And on that, is it a case that we had semi-state utilities to turn to for electricity, but we don't have semi-state heat? So in terms of who you turn to actually provide the solutions, was it just in terms of the avenue to making it a reality that was an easier path with electricity because you had expert bodies that you could turn to?
We probably don't have a dedicated heat semi-state, but we have semi-states incredibly dominant within the heat sector, which would be primarily Gas Networks Ireland, you could say, for the gas sector. And then for oil, I suppose there's a lot of policy intervention in the oil space, but it would be much more fragmented and privatised than the others. It's interesting when you frame it that way, because I remember I came across a document back in 1970s when Ireland had its first ever district energy conference, believe it or not. But it was around the time when we first discovered gas. And I often wonder back to that event, the guys who were there, had we not discovered Kinsale gas field at that time, could we have gone down a very different route? Because I would imagine once we found the gas resource, the semi-state was created, the gas networks was rolled out. Whereas if you look to the likes of Sweden and Finland, they have almost no gas grids. They very much went down the district heating route, and that was very much the foundation of having very high renewable heat shares now. So maybe there was a pivot there where, had our semi-state evolved in a different way, our pace could have been very different, because we do have semi-states in the renewable heat space, but they're in areas that have never been proven to be able to deliver large shares of renewable heat. You know, there's no city in Europe or the world that I'm aware of that has any substantial share of renewable heat from a gas point of view, but there is loads of examples of district heating systems and, of course, renewable electricity systems that then can be used for heat all around the world that have huge shares of renewable energy. So had our semi-state direction of travel gone a bit differently, we probably would be in a very different place. But it's not to say they don't exist. You know, there is semi-state companies very involved in the heat sector.
Like you said there, Paddy, the guys at the top of that European league table of renewable heating and cooling, you know, your Scandinavian countries, your Finlands, Denmarks, Sweden's, they're, I suppose, all have high shares of district heating, and I suppose that's enabled them to integrate much higher levels of renewables into their system. So if you think about it, I suppose district heating networks are a bit like the electricity grids for the heating world. So I suppose it's very complicated to switch every single building, every single home. Imagine if everybody had, I suppose, a diesel generator before, you know, generating their electricity and trying to switch that all over to renewables. I suppose the benefit there being there's just a cable that comes into people's houses and they don't know where the electrons come from. You know, I suppose district heating has given them that same, I suppose, freedom, like where the heat comes into their home, they're metered for the heat that they use. They don't care really where it comes from. It's on-demand hot water, like the way you have on-demand electricity. And in that way, we can, I suppose, and countries in Scandinavia have been able to integrate very large-scale renewable heat sources and been able to feed them into the grid. Like, you know, for example, large-scale CHP. You know, at the moment we're producing electricity and throwing away half of the the fuel that goes into those thermal power plants in the form of waste heat. So that's why I suppose a lot of our electricity is still so poorly, supply of electricity is so poor in terms of efficiency. So if we can, you know, like those other countries do, integrate that heat into the district heating network, supply that out. You know, there's tons of waste heat that we're throwing away at the moment that they're utilising and we're not. And to come back to Dave's point there about, I suppose, how and why they went down the route of district heating. You know, I used to joke saying that we needed a gas crisis, and probably, you know, because it was the oil crisis that I suppose helped them to move to district heating at the time. So it was back in the 60s and 70s when they decided, you know, look, we need to be moving away from oil. And as David said, like, you know, they didn't build out the gas grids, they built out district heating networks instead. So I don't know whether the current prices of gas will be enough, I suppose, to kind of give the district heating sector the kind of impetus that it requires now.
So I guess that's pretty recent in terms of development. So, you know, like when we look at like our cities' water systems, storage systems, etc., it's great that we get to benefit from the work that's been done in the past. Whereas this would be a very considerable undertaking for us to take on now, to go with district heating networks. But looking at those examples, it's a pretty recent history. And is it a case that, you know, you talk about that crisis element, and if this is done in Scandinavia, you know, surely Ireland is prime.
Yes, when we look at the historical stats, it was about 1% of your heat share per year they were able to convert. That was kind of a good proxy. So every year across probably 4 or 5 countries, if you looked at, Donna, there's like a consistent build out where they, like traditionally from about the 70s, they were able to convert 1% of their heat every year to district heating as a kind of steady build out that started at probably in the mid 60s to 70s, and in Scandinavia would have escalated over till about the 90s, and then they reached an almost saturation point where they're probably starting to go into more suburban areas all the time now, but the overall share is probably around 50 to 60% of their heat is now district heating. So that's kind of plateaued. And then, but the one point I think that's the most fascinating about the renewable heat world is, compared to renewable electricity, where we're trying to invent something or be the first to do something, for renewable heat, there's an ocean of proven technology out there. Like the example I often say to people is, if I want to increase my renewable heat share, I can pick up the phone to a supply chain in Europe and ask them to send me a product. Like, it's not, I don't have to ring up a research group or go to a lab to get something that might come in 5 or 10 years. This is a supply chain and technologies, not just in the district heating world, but in the heat pump space as well, that it has factories there. Like only a month ago, I was over in Finland to visit an industrial heat pump factory, that's spitting out heat pumps every week. It's not the hydrogen story, if you know what I mean. Or there's a few others that, there's something being developed that everyone kind of thinks will be the kind of magic bullet that will fix things. And sometimes that magic bullet can take too much of the conversation rather than just saying, well, actually, what do we already have? And people underestimate, I think, what we already have and what it can do.
So if we have, in a city, we have a district heating network and we have some parties who are feeding heat into it and then consumers taking heat out. In terms of the heat that's fed into it, what's the typical makeup of the sources of heat feeding into a district heating network?
Well, I suppose in terms of hierarchy, what you'd be looking at is, I suppose, what's the lowest carbon and lowest cost. And at the moment, it's all the heat that we're throwing away. So in Dublin alone, there's enough heat being thrown away to actually heat the whole of Dublin. So between industrial units, power plants, everything down to myself and David lived in Aalborg in Denmark, where they took the waste heat off a crematorium. Now I know that's probably an extreme example.
Fourth generation.
yeah, exactly. Literally nothing goes to waste. But we've kind of mapped out the whole of Dublin at the moment, and we've looked at every single source of all the way from low temperature to high temperature. So your power plants, you're looking at temperatures up to 1900 degrees that you can take straight off the power plant. Whereas there's also lots of low temperature sources that we're throwing away, like heat from data centres, etc. So the with lower temperature sources, we can use heat pumps. To boost them up. The company that Dave's working with, those large scale heat pumps, we can use those to boost up the temperatures of the waste heat to supply to buildings. And as buildings become more efficient, their temperature requirements come down. So more of those lower source waste heat supplies become more feasible, let's say, to plug into the network. Geothermal, for example, we haven't explored that at all. We've plenty of geothermal sources and solutions that we could be tapping into. But because of the expense, I suppose, of deep cores and deep drilling for geothermal, it hasn't happened yet. But district heating unlocks that whole sector for us.
But it's very much back to what Donna was just saying earlier, though. What the district heating grid does is gives you flexibility to change what your supply is. So if you look at the way we'd often talk in Ireland about the electricity mix, and how it's changing. So it's getting from X% wind this year to X% the next year. Like in Scandinavia, you can look at historical district heating supply mixes, and you can see almost from the mixes how the circumstances around them has changed depending on what mix is being used. So if you look at the 70s when the oil crisis was going on, coal was a very dominant fuel to supply the district heating systems. But then as the oil crisis eased off and the price of oil became less and less, you could see oil starting to come back in again. But next thing, the green revolution starts, and you can see bioenergy starting to come in the probably early 90s, late 90s. And all of a sudden, the wind space starts to take off, and then you start to see electric boilers come in because there's excess renewable electricity being produced, and the district heating goes, oh, that's cheap power, let's use that. And then as the number of operating hours of excess wind goes up, heat pumps suddenly become more economical. So instead of using a 100% efficient electric boiler, a 400% heat pump with a higher capex is now a better thing to put in a district heating network. So you can see over this. And actually, one of the other things that might surprise you is solar thermal is one of the major contributors, especially in more smaller towns, even in Denmark. So there's one town in South Denmark that has 50% of its annual heat load coming from solar thermal on a district heating system. So they've built a big solar thermal field with what is effectively a big pool of water as a storage, and they literally heat up the storage pit in the summer and use it in the winter for their heating. But so that mix is, I'd say its biggest asset is its flexibility, because you can, as Donna mentioned, like the electricity system, you can change what it is without the customer ever realising you've done it, depending on what fuel prices, carbon prices and everything else is around you. And that's kind of the benefit of it. You get that flexibility.
And even within the day, it's interesting to think that a windy day in the UK, in GB, would drop the electricity prices, and it would ultimately drop the price of heating our homes in Ireland.
Oh, completely, yeah. Like there's plenty of examples in Denmark where, there might be a calm day today, but the thermal storage is supplying our heat because it was filled up yesterday when it was windy.
Yeah.
You know, so you have electricity being produced 24 hours ago heating my home today, because that electricity would have been worth nothing if the heat pump or electric boiler wasn't in the district heating system. It would have been lost. So that's where flexibility and smart use of our electricity and responding to high wind production and low electricity prices, rather than like in Ireland right now, we're losing 2 terawatt hours of power due to dispatch down. That's wind farms producing power that we are just wasting and not using, and has already been paid for.
It happens to be the target for district heating by 2030 is 2.7 terawatt hours.
Yeah.
So, you know, I mean, these are the kind of things we can match. And I suppose one of the key points about the thermal storage is it's the cheapest form of energy storage we have. So obviously batteries are quite expensive, whereas a storage tank is just steel with a bit of insulation wrapped
about
around
100
it.
times cheaper, yeah.
Yeah. So it's their heat batteries, let's say, that we could be utilising very easily and very cheaply to supply that flexibility has all the advantages, I suppose, for the electricity grid as well as the heat sector.
And just when you go back, Paddy, to why we didn't do it, just like a funny story for you is like in the late noughties, I remember the first times ever presenting about district heating. The funny thing that I saw happen around then was there was almost a dangerous consensus of the unknown, in the sense that people would be in a room and everyone would agree district heating wasn't possible, but no one actually measured it. Do you know what I mean? There was this dangerous consensus of, oh, no, sure, that wouldn't make sense. Yeah. And then you'd say, well, what evidence is there that it doesn't make sense? Oh, sure, it just doesn't. You know, we never, like, no one had ever, like, actually checked. It was just kind of like, oh, it's not cold enough. And you're like, well, that's a bit of a assumption to make without anyone actually doing a study. Like.
Those assumptions were probably as well floated around by certain sectors who didn't want to see district heating necessarily come in and replace their sales of gas. You know,
and it's extraordinary to think about the lack of joined up thinking. Even on a small scale. So I've seen examples of cold storage refrigeration warehouses that are dumping heat from their warehouses and then electrically heating the offices that are adjoining, their own offices that are adjoining. And that's standard.
Yeah,
right?
that's standard.
And that's typical. Like, so even in terms of like your own reuse of heat and the potential. But Donna, you know, when you talk about, you know, when you were highlighting the kind of that merit order, it sounds like the mantras that we've gotten used to with recycling, with waste.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's about, to first of all, try to reduce, then reuse what's already there. And I suppose the equivalent of recycling is the ability to actually change the grade of heat as well.
Yeah.
And I suppose then from when you electrify the heat, so that last step, right, if you are electrifying the heat, that then is benefiting from the renewable energy in the electricity sector. And
that's currently being wasted.
A lot of it being wasted. And not only that, but I guess that when you use a heat pump rather than using a gas boiler, you reduce your final heating requirement by 2/3, right? You use about
at least,
a third.
You would say, yeah.
At least.
Yeah.
So at present Ireland has twice as much heat demand as electrical demand. But that actual, for the delivery of the energy into that heating sector, it could become smaller than electricity and leverage off it. Which
absolutely. And if you want to, this is not a theoretical thing. You can get on a plane and go 2 hours and see how it's already been done. You know, as in, it's not an idea.
No.
Well, you could also get into Tala now soon.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the loose.
I was just going to say, so you know, Donna, you're involved in a project in Tala where it's actually, you know, given everything that we've talked about, it's nearly funny to think that we need a demonstrator. You know, we need something to demonstrate this locally, given that the examples are already there, you know, to really on full scale.
Yeah,
but
it's still such a foreign concept, I suppose, to us in Ireland. You know, even when I went over to live in Denmark, I knew nothing about district heating beforehand, and I remember going around the house looking for the boiler and the hot press. I was like, how does the heating turn on? You know,
and just so for context, they waste heat from a data center, because a data center in reality, like, it converts electricity to heat,
basically,
and
everything that goes in
through the process of
and bits and bytes,
yeah. But the bits and bytes aren't reducing its efficiency; it's heat efficiency.
Yeah.
It's that rather than it just being a bar heater, in the process of producing the heat, it happens to do all of this computation and storage, etc. And we are, you know, everyone's very aware of the number of data centres we currently have in Ireland, the strain that they're putting on the electricity system, and that there's a desire to bring more on in some regards, or certainly a desire from the data centre industry to join. But it'd be great if you could talk us through this because it means that they can actually be a key contributor to our heating sector.
Yeah, I mean, they're one of the kind of biggest waste heat sources that we have at the moment, particularly in Dublin. So I suppose it's a good match. Usually kind of industries and that will be kind of located far away from, you don't want your waste incinerator beside your cities normally. We're lucky to get the one that we did in Dublin City Centre in that location. But usually they're put far away. And I suppose data centres all follow, I think it's called the T50, I think it's the name of the kind of the fibre network around the Dublin region. So they're all very close to obviously heat demands. So it's the location of the obviously the heat supply and the heat demand together. And what we did in Tala was, there was a new phase being built of an Amazon Web Services centre in the middle of Tala on the top of Bellegarde Road. We had already been looking at the technical feasibility of district heating in that area because South Dublin County Council's buildings, we had the Tala Hospital, we had TUD campus there. And I suppose those kind of key public sector buildings are kind of what we would call anchor loads for a network. So they're the kind of ones you tap into first, you get them on board and you can kind of connect everything in between then and start to grow the network off the back of those. So the data centre then, I suppose, had a planning requirement that the waste heat would be provided to a network when it was built. So the data centre then gives off about 25-degree waste heat. Obviously, the existing buildings anyway, that we're retrofitting for district heating require 70, 80 degrees. So we boost that then through. So the energy centre is being built, and in there that's going to have large-scale heat pumps, so 3 megawatts of heat pumps, and backup electric boilers. So there's no gas on site, no fossil fuels on site, no flues, no nothing. So that obviously transforms the low temperature waste heat from the data centre, boosts that up to the required temperatures, and we can obviously higher and lower that then for summer and winter as well, so there's that kind of flexibility. And then we take out the gas boilers in the existing buildings and replace them with heat exchangers. So I suppose one of the advantages for the consumer then as well is you've just got a heat exchanger, you've no gas connection, you've no boiler, you've no carbon monoxide risks, you've no all those safety issues that come with combusting fuels like on site. So I suppose all those buildings now have extra space that they can use, and then as soon as it's like build it and they will come. So every developer that's looking at doing or building anything around that area now are all asking us, when can we connect to the district heating network? Because the advantages for them are huge. They don't have to invest in any on-site renewables to meet their renewable requirements. They can basically tap into the renewable element from the district heating network. So again, the developer saves space, saves money on it's just a heat exchanger, very, very small. I mean, these take about half a car park space for an apartment block. Is the size of the unit required, the kind of heat substation. So no hassle then for them, in terms of supplying heat to, the gas boilers into each apartment, none of those issues. So for them, we're getting inundated with requests to know when they can connect. So
and the nugget on top that it's nicer to live in a house with district heating.
Yeah,
which is sometimes everyone thinks decarbonisation comes at a lifestyle cost. Like both of us have lived in homes with district heating. It's a far more enjoyable thing to live with. You have literally 24/7 on-demand heating and hot water. So you just pay in the same way that you pay for electricity for whatever you need. Instead of now having to go and turn on an immersion or turn on a boiler because you need some heat, you just turn on the tap and you get hot water and you pay if you use it and you don't if you don't. And for heating, the same.
Mm-hmm. And Renewable Energy Ireland published a vision paper, 40 by 30, to achieve, setting out an ambition to achieve 40% of our heat from renewable sources by 2030. But it sounds, first of all, like that certainly in the Dublin area, there's enough waste heat really to satisfy that. But clearly you need additional sources also feeding in terms of ensuring reliability and flexibility, etc. as well. But surely there's other solutions then needed for rural environments as well, in terms of how it is that we heat those. But before we kind of come on to that, I'm keen to, if we continue to focus on the district heating side for just a second, how does it work in practice? Like, so what do you do? Like, so Dublin wasn't built recently. And the housing stock in Dublin certainly wasn't built recently, and there's not much being built, enough being built at the moment. But in terms of with the existing housing stock, what is the plan? How do you actually integrate district heating network into our cities and then connect it to our homes?
Well, I suppose the connecting to the homes part is quite easy, I suppose, particularly in Ireland, because we have a lot of water-based systems. So if you have a water-based heating system, it's they can connect together quite easily. You're just
as in
switching
radiators.
Yeah. So you're switching out your gas boiler for your heat exchanger, basically. Now, if you're electrically heated, it's obviously harder to do, because you don't have those radiators, you don't have that kind of plumbing system in place. But I suppose, luckily in Ireland, most of our buildings are based on gas central heating.
Wouldn't be the case in France, for example. There'd be a lot of electric heating in France,
yes,
so they wouldn't have radiators, they'd have electric heating. So they'd have to do the double thing of not just the boiler being replaced, but also putting in a wet system, a radiator system.
Which is not insurmountable either. Like, I mean, there's great examples in Scotland where they had, so Aberdeen Heat and Power built a whole district heating network, switching over electrically heated apartments.
Well, I've done it in my house.
And you did it in your house, yeah. So these electrically heated apartments were at risk of fuel poverty. So there were social housing blocks that all had cheap storage heaters thrown in at the time, which are notoriously hard to control and use and expensive and everything else. So they switched all those blocks. So their primary objective was to switch those over, I suppose, and that was the driver for that district heating network. So again, it's like obviously harder to do, but I suppose again we're in a kind of an easier situation where our systems are water-based. So on the customer end, it's quite easy to retrofit. One of the advantages as well, I suppose, of if, say, in your house now, if you wanted to, you've an old, like I just said, Dublin's housing stock is old. The average rating is D2. And so there's a huge chunk of E's, F's and G's in there. So if you're sitting in a house that's been built in the 40s or 50s and you want to put in a renewable solution now, you have to do the whole insulation upgrade as well to get your heat pump to work efficiently and to qualify for all the grants. Whereas you could plug into district heating tomorrow and decarbonise 80% of your energy use, because 80% of your energy use is heat. So, I mean, it's a real quick win in terms of decarbonisation. And then you can go and do, bits of insulation and improvements on the fabric. But in terms of, I suppose, and this was one of the results of the SEAI heat study, was that, I know everybody said like the energy efficiency first approach is like the right way to go. But in terms of, they showed that, because they layered in behavioural studies onto that study as well, which is the first time, because usually it's just on a cost per CO2 basis. But they showed that at the rate of change in terms of retrofits, we won't get to the 2030 targets. Like, so district heating would enable us to, I suppose, have that speed to decarbonise first and then go back and kind of reduce the demand afterwards. So because it's a plug and play situation, So it's the pipes in the ground that we're missing. It's that connecting piece. The heat sources are there. As I said, like there's plenty of heat sources being thrown away. There's geothermal we could tap into, and heat pumps, ready to be plugged in. There's just no pipes in the ground to connect them. So everybody's just waiting for that piece of the puzzle to be. And I suppose the delay is like, who should be doing it? Who's going to build it? Where's the money going to come from? Who owns it? Because at the moment, up until very recently, the gas was very cheap. So to make it commercially attractive, to put in a huge upfront capital cost on a network. You know what I mean? It's a big ask for, nobody in the private sector is going to come and do that, because they've no guarantee of customers and they're competing with very cheap gas prices. So, there has to be some kind of subsidy in place, and it needs to be rolled out in the same way that our gas networks are rolled out and our electricity networks are rolled out as an essential public infrastructure. And once those pipes are in place, it opens up investment for the private sector in both the supply side and the consumer side.
So then turning from the urban environment to the rural environment, what are the solutions available there? So everything at the moment is certainly focused on heat pumps. And are heat pumps?
The way I always kind of break it down is if you take the heat sector at a very top level, you have about 50 terawatt hours of demand, 30 is buildings, 20 is industry. So the 30 that's buildings is about 50% district heating, 50% heat pumps, and the whole building stock will probably be able to reduce its demand by 20 to 30%. So that's your your magic sauce of how you decarbonise the building sector without getting into the granularity of loads of other things that can do smaller shares. If you're just taking the big chunks that are going to deliver 80% of your effort, your buildings are going to be district heating in the cities, heat pumps in the countryside, and then some savings that the buildings will, like the likes of the E, Fs and Gs that Donna mentioned. Like, it's so easy to put a bit of insulation in the attic and your return is really good, that you're always going to get some level of energy efficiency savings in homes. But there's almost a kind of self-sabotage and reduction as you do more and more savings, because the more you do, the less value you get for the next one you do. And people really historically have overestimated what energy efficiencies can actually deliver that way, because they've almost looked at, well, if we just get rid of demand, then our problems are solved. But if you look at the cost of it, it goes up so high as you get rid of the low-hanging fruit, that as a building stock, you tend to stop at 20 or 30% of an overall national heat saving reduction. And so it doesn't get you to like a zero carbon, it just takes a piece off the top. So if you take that piece off the top with the savings, urban areas, district heating, rural areas, heat pumps, normal standard heat pumps, but there's still 20 terawatt hours of the heat sector over on the industrial side. And that's probably what Astatine does, the company I'm with day to day. And that's probably heat pumps only up to a certain temperature level. So heat pumps are probably only going to be viable up to about 150 to 200 degrees Celsius as a solution. That's about 50% of the industrial heat market. And then beyond that 50% of the industrial heat market, you're going to need, I would imagine, some kind of clean fuel. So a bioenergy fuel or a hydrogen fuel or some kind of fuel that's a zero or low carbon fuel, because you probably at that point need to start burning something to get the temperature levels that you need.
And is there a temperature there where electrode boilers also take over for a range?
Absolutely, yeah. No, there is. Electrode boilers can definitely do that. I suppose the trade-off with electrode boilers is that they can tend to be requiring very, very large chunks of power so you'd need a really strong grid connection, a really strong user. But no, they definitely could. What share? I'm not sure. I don't have the kind of good visibility of what share of the above 200 degrees C could electrode do versus fuel. But no, definitely, Paddy, they could absolutely play a big role in that space for sure. And
so when we look at the different grades of heat, I suppose in terms of it's both the environment and the use case for the heat, so we have the ideally reduce, but then our reuse, recycle in terms of change the grade of it. We have our ability to have district heating networks take waste heat from in certainly urban environments, and then we have our heat pumps also feeding into that. But we have our heat pumps in our rural environment. When we go then to higher grades of heat, then I suppose even for industrial sectors, so heat pumps will deliver up to much higher temperatures than we need in a residential environment for industrial. And then you have your electrode boilers, and then at last resort you're burning something. And
exactly,
ideally it's a biofuel that you're burning at that point, or some renewable
fuel. Like hydrogen produced from renewable electricity. Could be that's a very good way of putting it. That's your kind of priority order, as you mentioned. So you're trying to get the maximum efficiency one first, which is like your heat pump, but that can only go to a certain point. Then you get your maximum efficiency is your electrode boiler using clean electricity because it's 100%. But then you're moving to hydrogen, which is probably only 60% efficient in terms of producing it with the same electricity you could have used through an electrode boiler. And then bioenergy potentially as an alternative to hydrogen if you can't get the hydrogen from a clean source. But the magic of just to flag there again, it's back to, if you looked at what Sweden, Finland, Denmark, a number of Germany, what they've done, it's kind of like the district heating story. That industrial heat pump is not new. That's 30 years ago. The electro boiler is not new. Norway has a number of those. But the hydrogen piece is very new. So it's just to be careful of putting them in the same list, because two of them have been around for 30, 40 years and have been like that. That's back to, I can pick up a phone and order an electro boiler. I can pick up the phone and order an industrial heat pump. I can't pick up the phone and order an industrial grade hydrogen production facility tomorrow that will be able to do what I wanted to do. And bioenergy you can to some degree, but there's the supply chain for that is nearly as complicated as the technology piece, you could say, but it is absolutely there. But that's probably the thing that is so important to emphasize about renewable heat, it's at a phase where we're so bad. The good thing of being so bad is you can literally do so much by just doing what's already there. And I suppose when you look at those lists, district heating in urban areas, heat pumps for rural buildings, industrial heat pumps, electro boilers, them four are absolutely all sitting there, proven, well established, and can be done. Like even as Donna said, the Tala district heating system will use an industrial heat pump because it's not a new technology. It's been around for years. So that's the real upside of being on the bottom.
Last place, yeah, exactly.
And in terms of the integration, it sounds like the integration is reasonably straightforward. Certainly when we talk about the district heating system, it's in contrast to the other areas that we're tackling to integrate renewable energy into other sectors, so electricity and otherwise, that it has bigger gains because it's a bigger problem, and it's reasonably easy to integrate given the heating solutions that are already in the current housing stock. When you look at in the industrial application and the integration of either heat pumps, electrode boilers, how does it fit in with their existing heating systems?
It's phenomenally easy compared to what people, when you arrive on site, think it is. So I can't tell you how many sites I've arrived to and I've been told at the gate, there's certainly nothing you could do here. I think this site is too good. And you go in and you're like, well, you have 70 degrees C water going to a cooling tower here and you need 90 degrees C water over there. A heat pump could get a COP of 7 or 8, boosting that. But they think that's 70 degrees, it's useless to us. We need 90, we can't use it. I've seen sites throw away 90 degree water and not think it's useful for them. The most common, in fairness, is very much like what Donna mentioned with the data centre. The most common thing we'd see is temperature ranges of 30 to 35 degrees, up to 40 maybe being thrown away. That's like every site I go on, there's a 35, 40 degree waste heat stream just going down the drain. Ironically, would you believe, which is you're sitting there kind of pinching yourself, I can't tell you how many sites I've been on and the client is telling us we have a discharge temperature problem. In other words, we're trying to put in cooling towers to reduce the temperature of which we're discharging water. At the same time, we're producing megawatts of hot water at 60, 70, 80 degrees C. And then the really amazing part is that 70, 80 degrees C water is being produced from a boiler that they're producing 160 degrees steam with to produce 70, 80 degree hot water. So you have a cold source going down the drain that they're building a cooling tower for to solve going out into a river or wherever they're sending it so that it's cool enough. You have a steam boiler using gas or LPG to produce 160 degrees C hot water that's then, or steam, to produce 80 degree hot water. And the amazing thing is that you can sometimes even see these things are right beside each other. So you can literally put a heat pump in the middle and go, well, I'll solve your cooling load by soaking that up by the heat pump, and I'll reduce your gas use by now producing your hot water or whatever need it would be. Up to that limit, though, that's where existing heat pump technology is probably capping out at 130 degrees C. So you are able to do a portion, but it's a very significant portion. You would see sometimes on sites, 50, 60% of their entire heat load would be that level of hot water use. But there's a funny situation there where they're convinced there's nothing you can do. It's not that they think the technology, we've looked at it and we've had people in and we've scoped it out. It's just, as I said to you, the danger of common consensus. It's like this common consensus can form where without looking at something, everyone is telling each other it doesn't work and nobody has actually said, well, maybe we should actually measure it and check it.
Well, I guess, though, there is, an element where people have the message that heat pumps are low temperature heating systems, so that's what people have heard in terms of how they need to upgrade their houses, etc., is to go for a low temperature heating system. And maybe it's called the wrong thing. Maybe
I
a heat pump needs to be
agree.
called a heat multiplier.
And it's definitely called the wrong thing because, as Donna mentioned with the data center, your heat source there is 25 degrees C water, whereas in a home your heat source is air. It could be minus 10 degrees C outside air. So in an industry in the middle of December, they're still running their production process. So you're still in the middle of winter getting 25, and the data center in the middle of winter for the Tala district heating system will still likely throw out 25 degrees C water for the heat pump to use. And that's where, as you said, Paddy, it does need a different name. And it's like as if heat pump is used in a context where you have a really poor supply, and it's also used in the context where you have a really good supply, but then they all get mushed in together and people kind of perceive it then as something collective. And the core technology is the same thing, but the performance of it, the application of it is totally different, if you know what I mean. So it'd be wonderful if you could just like rebrand the whole sector.
And get the message out there that have people understand that it multiplies your heat by a factor that's greater than the amount of energy you need to put into it to do it.
Exactly. And you're typically looking at 4 to 5, at least in most of the sites we're looking at. So you put in 1 unit of electricity, and I'm sure the Tala scheme is probably in a similar ballpark. You'll get 4 times the heat out of it.
And that's because there's already the heat source coming into it.
Yeah, so really what it's doing, it's actually it's soaking in heat at a low temperature, and then the electricity is boosting the temperature of that heat. So you're not creating energy. Obviously, thermodynamics is still there, but you're just boosting the temperature of the energy that's within the heat pump.
And it's much more efficient, I suppose, to have one large heat pump, say in a district heating system, where you have people operating it who really know how to use it, who control it all day and can vary, you know what I mean, they understand how it works. Whereas when you're putting these new technologies into people's homes who've never don't know how to use them, don't know how to operate them, they're not being serviced properly. If you have thousands of those instead of one large one that's being, operated at top efficiency all day. The contract we have with the operators in the Tala system is linked to the efficiency. So it's an energy, there's energy performance built into the contract. So it's their incentive to always make sure that system operates as efficiently as possible 24/7.
And just to give you an idea, Paddy, there was over 1,000 megawatts of large-scale heat pumps on the district heating systems in Sweden in the 80s. In the 80s. So we're, 30 odd years later, more than 30 odd years later, we're putting in the first one as a demo in Ireland. So it's like, there's just to try and emphasize that broken record point I keep making. It's proven stuff. It's not like we're trying to, the demo is made because we are not used to it. It's not because the technology is not used to it.
Yeah. We could nearly have, there's so much interest in the Tala scheme. I had a joke with the guys in South Dublin that we could have a kind of a tour, a permanent tour guide there to bring people in and out all day, because they just, it's such a still a foreign concept to us here.
That's extraordinary. And when people from the Nordics visit Ireland and just get these entire misconceptions and hear the entire misconceptions, it must be just entirely alien.
It is, but the funny thing is, when I was out doing that tour where I went to visit the industrial heat pump plant in Finland, what was really, I suppose, in a way reassuring but interesting, they started at the exact same point we did. One of the first plants that the company I was visiting did was, it was a large meat processing plant where the chiller was literally next door to the boiler. So they did start from the same, I suppose, realization that why are we doing things in this inefficient way?
Just a long time ago.
So
when they visit Ireland, it must be like a time machine experience going back in time.
Very much so, yeah. And to be honest, what they do then is they're educating us. They're we're sitting there going, oh no, we went to this site and they thought this wasn't possible. Well, here's a site from 20 years ago if you want to have a look at it, and it's installed in 2005. And
sometimes they get jealous of us, though, because I suppose there's so many things that they could do. They wish they could start off with a clean slate and kind of go, oh, well, I would have done this if we had known.
And their home markets are somewhat saturated, if you know what I mean. Even the companies in district heating that we'd often deal with and the heat pump market, they're coming here because, Sweden is 65% renewable heat.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly...
And we're starting with higher temperature sources to start, so it's in terms of the benefit here is we can achieve more, we can leapfrog in terms of the technologies and that. And, we spoke earlier about, when we were chatting about the residential sector, the experience there is going to be that people will be changing out their source of heating. Whereas when you deal with the industrial sector is far more risk sensitive. So when the renewable heating systems are brought into the industrial spaces, is it a case that it's in line with their existing heating systems? So it's
almost always.
It's almost always.
It's always because the thing is, it's not just the benefit. They're not just getting, and actually this has become very top of mind in the last few months especially, it's not just a carbon reduction and a cost reduction, it's a resiliency benefit now. So now all of a sudden you have a dual heating system. So that, again, you could almost say it is done in parallel, but not just because they're worried about the renewable heat system. It's actually because it's bringing an additional benefit to the company. So if you imagine they're putting in, like let's say we've looked at projects with 3-year paybacks, right? And the 3-year payback is an absolute no-brainer because the price of, let's say, LPG or gas is so high now. But a natural question they'll often say is, but what about gas goes down really low in a couple of years if things change again? And you're saying, well, this technology has a 20-year lifetime. If within 20 years you expect to have a gas price higher in terms of ratio than electricity at this level, this will pay itself off in that 20 years. Now that's an incredibly high probability situation you're looking at there. Like, as in, we're not saying, like, if some things change dramatically, like we've seen dramatic change in the last 12 months, and all of a sudden LPG or gas drops off a cliff for some unknown reason, and then all of a sudden you're feeling a bit exposed, well, just switch back to your fossil fuel if you feel cost is the absolute driver for you. You can then switch over to the heat pump again in a year's time, because there's whatever about there being, like, even I would argue there's a small chance of LPG or gas prices going off a cliff in the future for quite a long time. But if you do feel that that's the case, the probability of that happening on a regular basis over the next 20 years with carbon taxes and security of supply issues is incredibly small. So you get that kind of resiliency where you can switch now between fuel sources, you know, and like what you do, Paddy, with demand response, it could even be down to the granular scale of, well, this is a windy day tomorrow, let's use the heat pump. This is an incredibly tight middle of winter, power supplies are tight, there's all sorts of extra costs because it's peak tomorrow compared to what it was a month ago. Let's use the heat pump, let's turn off the heat pump for a week because this is a very high power price period, and let's just use the gas or LPG for that period. And from a carbon point of view, now you might be getting an 80-90% of the year you're using the low carbon source. That's an incredibly positive step forward compared to using gas or LPG 100% of the year, if you know what I mean. So you mightn't be getting, you're giving customers that benefit from a purely cost point of view, but from a carbon you're making a huge impact, even though you mightn't be getting it all the way. It's still very good.
From the customer point of view, minimal regret cost.
Minimal, you know, especially in the current context. You know.
And, you know, with what we do at Viotas, at night I dream of new sources of flexibility on the grid. So how can we use the electricity customers to provide services to the grid? And there's a real double bubble benefit in the element of the renewable heat that's coming from electricity, because we previously, particularly in the residential sector, we never had many discretionary loads. So demand response and consumer participation in other countries, like in the US, has been quite high in the residential side because of air conditioning, where the problem is also a potential solution. Because when it comes to providing flexibility, where it's important to reduce the customer's demand at a particular time or otherwise, in our homes at the moment, really, our peak in the evening, we're cooking, it's the lights on, it's, you know,
we need
it's entertainment to keep the kids quiet. We need it. Whereas now when you electrify heat, we now have this really malleable load that can provide flexibility to the grid.
Yeah.
And so it's not only benefiting from the renewable content in the electricity, it gives back flexibility that allows grid operators to use more, to integrate more renewable energy in the first place, so it ends up increasing it. So, like, the benefits the benefits seem huge. Obviously, there will be a massive road to getting to where we need to go in terms of policy direction, right down to implementation. And I suppose, you know, I'm really intrigued to explore where policy is at, and I think we have to acknowledge that with major changes that, you know, because of voting cycles, the lifespan of a politician can be quite short, potentially, and they're always looking at that and what is going to, you know, maximum. You know, what's the maximum that they can do that doesn't reduce their chances going forward? So, in being able to come into the next government, so we need, for true major ambition, I think we need European policy that transcends. That's where European policy, I think, is key, because it transcends governments and iterations of governments and politicians, etc. But it has to go Europe, then down to government level, national policy level, and then down to implementation.
I think the government at the moment are working on the first heat policy for Ireland, which will be a huge step change. You know, I mean, it's the first time that there's going to be a blueprint for what will happen in the heat sector, and hopefully that will transcend past the next 3, you know, longer than the next 3 years and longer than this current government. Like, we haven't seen anywhere, like, I mean, the last couple of years, the change in support for district heating has been massive. Like, you know, we were back when, remember there was a white paper, I think it was when Alex White or somebody was in, and there was like one mention of district heating as a word, and it was something like, we may think about investigating sometime in the future, looking at district heating, you know, and it was never... Nothing was ever done on it. But now we have the SEI's heat study, which says, you know, which backs up our own Irish District Energy Association figures, that says, you know, about 50% of Ireland's heat could come from district heating, is feasible for district heating. So that now is feeding into all government policy. They have established a district heating unit in the department. There's dedicated staff now. There's a steering group that meets every month, that, you know, that I sit on with a group of other people in across departmental group who are helping us to get through all the barriers and all the policy issues and everything like that, because I suppose the current minister and it really wants to drive this, like really feels very passionately about it, and, you know, really wants to see this happen within his term. Like, so I suppose we're just trying to take advantage of that at the moment, and that, you know, that kind of bit of drive behind it, and push as much stuff through as we can the next 3 years, and get everything kind of set up that we can actually start to roll this out at large scale. I
think with a lot of the initiatives that have been taken by the current government, you know, we really hope that we see that term continue on, because there's been just an absolute sea change in terms of the attitude towards the delivery of solutions, and not just talking about solutions, but delivering them, getting the plans in place. And
well, I'd say as well, it was probably a very fortunate thing that the Green Party got in just before the crisis came, in the sense that what I mean there is, had that momentum not started a couple of years ago, we would only started scrambling for ideas now. Yeah. Whereas I think what happened was a lot of the foundations of what we should be doing were in the background, and then the crisis made everyone go, okay, now we should actually do them rather than delay them. So,
but with the current crisis now, that's the current situation in Ukraine has now drawn people's attention to the fact that decarbonisation and reducing energy consumption isn't an altruistic effort, that there's a direct link between our energy security and our national sovereignty, and that this is absolutely critical.
And I think the focus as well, like, you know, I think we've, you know, the country's been guilty of having that focus on electricity before, and I think, you know, this crisis has shown that how much energy we use and how much fossil fuels we use in transport and heat, because that's what affects everybody's everyday lives, you know. So I think that's helped to kind of redistribute the focus a little bit.
And heat is a critical utility. The cold can kill you.
And it has done. You know, there's been, you know, speaking of the Ukraine, like when Russia turned off the gas about 7-8 years ago, I think it was, there was a correlation to deaths then at the time, where it was in the middle of winter, and, you know, if you don't have heat, it's a very dangerous thing. You know, electricity can, if it's not heat, electricity is providing, it's often, I suppose, beneficial things, but not right to the core of survival, whereas heat is very much there. But I must commend, like, the SEI did just release a national heat study, and I always call it the all-island grid study moment when I make the parallel to the electricity sector. It feels like it's that. Like, I suppose you can remember back as well, Paddy, when that came out, you know, you'd hoped that it was going to then lead to lots of things from it, and there's no guarantee it would. But it did, you know, in the electricity sector, it really did. Like, we did get refit, we got Grid Gate 3, we got kind of a real focus on then moving forward. So that this new national heat study from SEI, it does flag district heating as critical in urban areas, heat pumps in rural areas, industrial heat pumps up to 200 degrees C. And then it does mention above that things like electro boilers, hydrogen, bioenergy need a kind of better understanding of exactly what they'll contribute and things like that. So it is putting in place things that I would have said in my mind would have been very sensible things to do to get us off bottom of the pile. You know, there's really great stuff in there.
So this is really the precursor to us getting to binding targets and then to implementation.
Let's hope so. You know, let's hope so. Let's hope it's the evidence base now that the all-island grid study was to put us where leading in renewable electricity. So if you know, the way you started this was asking what were the parallels that got us there. This is probably at least step 0 of the parallel that worked so well with renewable electricity.
And it's very aligned with what happened in those Scandinavian countries back in the 60s and 70s. They brought in very strong heat policy, very strong heat acts, and actually that word heat act has been dropped into conversation with the department and stuff like that. So I think, you know, that's one of the expected outcomes from this heat policy as well. Whereas if we have those that same kind of foundation there, like, you know, we can start to see the kind of, hopefully, the scale up of change.
Donna, David, it's been brilliant to get to talk through this, because I've been siloed in the electricity market, and
bringing you into the heat world,
and willingly, very willingly so, you know. And I had I suppose in the lead up to this, I didn't appreciate the scale of the challenge, but also the massive opportunity that exists to use heat to make a very significant contribution towards our overall decarbonisation objectives. So it's been really interesting to get to talk that through. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.